Hi there. Thank you for joining. We are just about getting ready to go. We wanted to make sure that we had everybody join. And I'm really thrilled to welcome you today. My name is Leslie Hammer, and I'm a professor and associate director of applied research at the Oregon Institute of Occupational Health Sciences at Oregon Health and Science University. I'm also the director of the Oregon Healthy Workforce Center, which is a total worker health center of excellence funded by the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health. And I'm really happy to welcome you to the Working Well webinar today. This is a series that's a bi-monthly webinar series that highlights unique challenges that are impacting workers in Oregon and beyond. And the series is designed to help safety and health professionals, policymakers, and experts in occupational safety and health and well-being stay informed of the best trends in the world of work. In addition, this Working Well webinar series addresses worker safety, health, and well-being topics from a total worker health perspective. This emphasizes hazard-free work environments, integration of physical and psychological health in the workplace, and the design of work for optimal well-being. Working Well is a program of the Oregon Institute of Occupational Health Sciences at OHSU. So before we begin today, what I'd like to do is to note a few housekeeping items. First of all, participants are asked to be, or they will be actually muted during the webinar, and then we'll unmute during the Q&A period. If you would like to post questions during the webinar, during the presentations, please go ahead and do that. And if it's kind of relevant and helpful at the time, I'm going to go ahead and raise the question with the panelists, with the presenters. And also then, if you would like to chat with other participants or share resources, please use the chat. I'm going to be doing that as well, and I'm going to be sharing a couple of citations with you during the presentations. So on the lower left-hand side of your screen, you're going to find a closed caption button. Please use that if needed. And then we also want to remind you that those who wish to receive SHRM credit for today's session can do so. And we'll share a code at the end. We're recording today's session, and we really appreciate everybody being here today. And a special thanks to our presenters today, Dr. Steve Hunt and Casandra Kerr. And specifically, what we are really excited about is this opportunity to be able to talk about AI and occupational safety and health. And as you know, and as you're probably well aware of, it's really rapidly changing. Lots has happened, lots is going on in terms of the world of work, the future of work, and AI. And we're here to kind of break down some of those issues. And what I'd like to do is also let you know that a second follow-up seminar is going to happen July 14th, and that will be led by Dr. Tahara Probst and Dr. David Dorn. Dr. Probst has done quite a bit of work in this area of AI and occupational safety and health. And Dr. Dorr is with OHSU, and he's a professor in medical informatics. Across both sessions, a central message that impacts of AI are really not fixed. They depend on choices that organizations make. So in this session, Dr. Hunt is going to create some framing for the discussion, providing some historical context, and while also discussing AI and the world of work. We'll then turn to Casandra Kerr, who comes to us from the U.S. Bank, and she'll provide us a kind of case scenario. So I'd like to start with just introducing Dr. Hunt, and he is an internationally recognized expert on the intersection of human psychology and workplace technology, and also business performance. Many of you are probably familiar with Dr. Hunt's work. It focuses on how organizations can use technology to improve employee experience, engagement, and well-being at work. We're excited to have him share his insights on how AI is reshaping work and what that means for workers and organizations. And Casandra Kerr, Senior Vice President and Program Director of Model risk management at US Bank, and she oversees the use of models, including AI. So she's really bringing in even more of a practical kind of a scenario and examples based on her experience and valuable insight in how organizations can safely and effectively implement these technologies. So at this point, I think I'm going to turn it over to Steve. I guess we do have somebody who is actually advancing our slides, and I'm sorry that I didn't give you any indication, Justin, of when to advance the slides, but you're doing beautifully. I know that we did have some objectives on there, and hopefully those were covered and people saw those enough. But I think at this point, I'd like to turn it over to Steve. And basically what we're going to be doing is having a period of presentations, then some discussion back and forth between Steve and Cassandra, and then I will also jump in and be involved. And I'll also bring forward any questions that are showing up in the chat. But we would like this to be interactive and lively as much as we can in a webinar environment. So Steve, I think that at this point, I'm handing it off to you, and Justin, that what you need to do now is go to Steve's slides.
Oh yeah, that's it. All right. Yeah, looking for the dog, Justin. Thank you. Thank you, Leslie.
All right.
Yeah. So I'm really excited to have this opportunity to chat with everyone. And to Leslie's point, please put questions in the chat, raise your hand if we're going along with anything. I will guarantee you that Leslie, Cassandra, and I could easily spend the entire time just talking with each other about AI, which we will if nobody else joins in. But we'd love you to come in and have conversations and discussions. The way we're going to do this is I'm going to talk a little bit about the things that I'm seeing in the world of AI, and just a little bit about who was asked to advisors. I used to be the chief expert for work in technology for SAP, which is a huge technology company. My whole career is focused on using technology to improve work. I actually was a computer programmer, and I did AI programming way back in the 1990s using something called maximum entropy techniques. But the problem was the technology was so unbelievably slow. And that's changed. I was joking with Alexis Fink, who's my partner. She was the head of analytics for Meta. That, we tell, kids these days, we can make, you can make mistakes in seconds that it took us days to make when we were younger with AI, because it just went so slowly. And so I'm going to be talking, though, about some of the things that we're learning now that AI, we can finally implement these mathematical models. And Cassandra and I were totally geeking out about this because we've had a lot of work in this area. I'm going to frame up some general tips, and then Cassandra is going to come on and talk about the stuff that she's experiencing doing this stuff at US Bank. So going to the next slide, please. Whoa, there we go. Thank you. So, as Leslie and I were talking about this before, it's a really interesting thing when you look at what's happening in occupational health and safety. If you look at the roots of occupational health and safety itself as a field, it was created due to technology's impact on work. The Industrial Revolution created working conditions that suddenly made people realize this technology is damaging people's health and literally killing them in some cases at scale. And it led to, a whole regulations and processes and all this thing to think about how can we make sure that people working in these work environments are doing it in a way that is safe for them. And actually that picture is the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, which is one of the famous things that led to occupational health and safety rules in New York, and I think it was in the 1920s. So all of our work has been focused on how, when we automate physical tasks, how that affects well-being. But now we're going to this world where we're automating mental tasks. And this picture actually there, that is a drone operator. So if you want to kind of read, what does it do when you take soldiers out of the battlefield and have them kill through drones? It's not good. Psychologically. And we're dealing with all sorts of things where it's like, suddenly all this stuff that couldn't be automated before can now be automated. And we're in this sort of interesting point. It's like having a lot of raising some issues of how do we do this safely. So if we go to the next slide, though, I'm curious just to get a quick take on the audience, kind of say, where are you now? Where would you place your organization now when it comes to AI? And I've worked with lots of organizations. I've seen them in all of these areas. I've seen them in, we're actively resisting it. We don't want to let our employees use it at all, to, we're messing around with it, people have it, to we have whole programs focused on it. And then a really common one, and don't be afraid to put it there as relevant, is, well, we've got it and we're using it, but we really don't have a clear defined strategy for it. That's kind of like option F. So I'd be curious as you're going along, just kind of place your organization on this poll and we'll take a look at the answers. That'll also help Cassandra and I also as we get into the conversation about how much we have to spend on sort of more the basic stuff about AI versus some of the more advanced stuff. So it's good to kind of see where everyone is. All right, look, these votes are coming in. Always like Justin, I don't know if you can show this as we get live updates. Some of the podcasts, it reminds me of like a horse race where you can see which option is winning in real time.
Yes, it should be live now for participants.
Oh, can you tell me? I can't see it.
Got it. So right now the highest one is at 35%, learning about AI and defining our AI strategy.
Oh, right in the middle. Perfect. Okay. Do you have anyone that admitted to being in using AI solutions but not fully understanding what they're doing?
Yes, that's the second highest at 27%.
And I would guess everyone that could say C could probably also say F2. You just can't choose the multiple choice. Well, thanks everyone. I think for that, that's good because that gives a good sense of talking about this. And I think it's interesting. We get to go to the next slide, please, Justin. One of the things about AI, which is both a benefit and a curse, is it's really easy to use without understanding what you're doing completely. And so if you thought about how with past technologies, kind of the way that they evolved is you'd understand how it works, and then you kind of use it in different ways, and then you use it in more advanced ways. Well, in AI, you could jump right into creating agents and stuff like that. You might struggle with it without fully understanding what these agents are doing and the data like that. And so that kind of creates some really interesting risks, but it also creates tremendous pressure on us and organizations who use this to think that you're like, oh, wait, hang on, everyone, step back till we figure this out. That's not going to work in a world of AI because one, business leaders aren't going to do it. They're going to say, no, we need this stuff. Our competitors are using it. We got to move forward. How do we march forward in a way where we minimize the potential risks? Which gets to the next question: what are these risks? What's happening? So go to the next slide, please. Justin? Oh, hey. So the thing I kind of had to put this slide in here because I showed this thing. The thing about AI is everyone's confused about it. I will share from me personally. I've been confused about AI since I was a small child. Going back to that's actually a picture of me on my dad's shoulders about when a book came out that he wrote in 1975. Called Artificial Intelligence, and it was a tour de force of the mathematics behind artificial intelligence. And in this, that is a direct quote from that book. He said, the mathematics works for creating natural language processing in computers, but the computers are too slow. This problem will be solved. And sure enough, that's what happened. Two things happened. One, we got masses of data from the internet. At the same time, we got these new computer processing speeds. We had all of the math. As I said, I did AI programming in graduate school. It just was really slow and we didn't have the data. These two things came together. And what's happened is it suddenly just propelled the world forward very, very quickly. So next slide, please. And so when you look at AI, there's kind of two main flavors of AI when you're looking at it. And I want to spend a lot of time on this. Important to realize the one, machine learning, which is basically feeding AI data. It goes back, it learns. I developed some very sophisticated staffing technology for this in 2005. Cassandra's going to talk about this a lot. This has been around for a long time. And it often is going along in the background, like used for credit ratings and other things like that for airline reservation systems, all sorts of places. This was happening, but it was happening in the background. What happened, though, that has made the explosion is when we were able to apply machine learning techniques to all of the data on the internet to create these natural language, large language models. And that's what's kind of like blown AI open suddenly, is when these two things came together. And it's a whole different conversation we're not going to get into about the difference between machine learning and generative AI. I will say, if this is not something that is really familiar to you, it is something you should learn about because it is, if you're working with AI, you should have a good, solid understanding of it. You don't need to know all the details, but have a good concept of how these things actually work. We're not going to spend time on that, but that would be, feel free to follow up with us on that. We could share things on that. So when you look at this, so what happened is, next slide, please. What has happened, though, why we are so overwhelmed as a society, is that because we had the mathematics for AI and all we were waiting, and we had the data on the internet, and suddenly when the NVIDIA chip was happened, these things all came together and there was this absolute explosion of innovation. Now, if you compare this to other technological innovations, the big technology innovations in my lifetime, and one predates my lifetime, one was digital processing. The Turing machine was invented in 1943. It took like 30 years until the Apple II that it really became widespread. And even then, most people didn't have Apple II computers. So it played out over time. The next big transformation is digital access to data through like our iPhones. Same thing. Took like 25 years to go from technological innovation to actually widespread consumer adoption. AI, 2 years from the NVIDIA chip to ChatGPT releasing it on the world. And it's just, imagine if we'd gone from rotary phones to the iPhone 17 in 2 years. It's the pace of this change that is so overwhelming to us. Do I think it's going to be the end of the world? Blah, blah. No, I don't. Do I think there poses real risks? Yeah, we've definitely learned that with the cell phone, and don't text when you drive and all this other stuff. There's real well-being risks to it. But a lot of it, I think, what is a challenge is how fast this is happening is what's kind of overwhelming us. And so what I think it's useful to put this in a broader context, though, because what AI is doing is it's accelerating the digital shift that's been happening in work already. Next slide, please. Which is technology, and this is one thing, is technology going to eliminate work? No. In the history of technology, it has never eliminated the need for people to work. What it does is it eliminates some jobs and creates new jobs, but the jobs it creates are much different from the jobs it eliminates, and it's fundamentally altering the very purpose of work. And I wrote a book called Talent Tectonics a few years ago that really dives into this, and AI has just accelerated everything that book talked about, which if you look at the purpose of work, 200 years ago, the main reason people worked was to grow and distribute food so we didn't die. The purpose of work was to keep us alive. And then the next change, the Industrial Revolution, automated the growing and distribution of food. So we shifted a lot of work from keeping us alive to making things. And that led to the first occupational health and safety, was that automation of work, putting people in factories, all those other things. Now, the move of technology has been steadily moving us to the third thing, which is now the main purpose of work, is what's called knowledge and service work. Most jobs, even jobs that are manufacturing jobs, what people are doing is they're monitoring machines, or they're managing human relationships to solve problems and make people feel good about what it is the company's doing for this. What this does, though, is it's going from physical tasks to more psychological tasks. And I often say anyone who says work was better 50 years ago probably did not work 50 years ago. Work literally shortened our life. It ground us down. It's why we have occupational health and safety. But work is psychologically much more difficult than it used to be because of all the things that are happening, the bombardments and the different things we need to change and different to think about. And this is and AI has just put this into turbocharge mode, something we were already experiencing. Next slide, please. And this is played out. This is interesting if you look. And I kind of, in preparing for this talk, I went and kind of dug into the data. And by the way, AI helped me create this slide. Give it credit. Thank you, Claude. But I did ask it for all the references to make sure I knew where it was getting the data from, which are on the bottom. But if you look at the ratio of physical workers' comp claims versus mental health, mental well-being workers' comp claims, it used to be there's still far more physical than mental well-being ones. But it used to be there were 100 physical claims for every one mental well-being. Now there's 5-to-1 ratio. And part of this is awareness and understanding of mental health, but another part is literally the world's burning people out, the distractions, the things like that, the anxiety, all these things. And AI has just ramped this up. And this sort of requires us kind of rethinking how we approach the idea of employee health and safety and well-being in an AI saturated world. So next slide, please. So I'm going to quickly go through some risks, and then I'm going to ask Casandra to come on. But I wanted to say the question I said earlier, AI is not going to eliminate work. It is going to radically change work. And so you wonder, well, how is it going to change work? Well, if you want to know how technology is going to change work, don't focus on what the technology can do. Focus on what it can't do. There are two things AI cannot do, and they're related to each other. And increasingly, this is what we're going to see people employed to do. The first is it can't actually care for other people. Caring is, at the psychological level, it is the gift of one's life in the form of time and attention to the well-being to another living thing. It is an organic act. AI can act like it cares, but it can't actually care. And it's really powerful. Like a good example of this is AI has some really powerful applications for teaching. But when you ask people about like teachers that really made a difference in their life, what you're always going to hear them is that teacher cared if I learned. AI can do all the transactional stuff, but it can't actually do that. And the second thing is because it can't care about people, it can't imagine how to make the world better for people in the sense of, you know, it can solve whatever problem we give it, but it can't decide if a problem is worth solving or if there's a way we might do things differently that would make the world better outcomes for people. So increasingly, this is what we're going to be focusing on, these kinds of jobs. But these are jobs that require a lot of mental and emotional effort. And so, it's hard to be caring if you feel exhausted and burned down. It's hard to be creative if you feel just like overwhelmed by everything that's going on. And so, how do we start to rethink it? Think of this. So, when we look at AI, go to the next slide, please. As I say, one of the things is when we look at AI, I would say, like, if you went into your organization and said, we need to slow down how fast we're using AI, I do not recommend that from a career longevity standpoint. Better would be to say, how can we look at AI in a way that we're using it, but we're getting people excited about it and we're showing that we care about how this is affecting their lives and their well-being. This is a quote from a friend of mine, Nathan Christensen, about AI. I love it. He's like, it's hard to be excited about running in a race if you're afraid of what might be at the finish line. Well, if you're worried, oh, you're just going to automate my jobs, or you're going to make my job horrible or whatever, we have to really kind of define that. So employees, one, we don't want to do that to people, but two, how do we do this so that we actually end up in a better place with AI and we don't inadvertently create really horrific working conditions, which ultimately will not lead to sustainable companies. So I'm going to go through 7 risks really quickly that are emerging from what research has been done. But remember, there's no great peer review research on this stuff yet because it's only been around for like 2 or 3 years. So, somebody asked me what's best practices for this. It's like, I don't know, we couldn't do it before. We're trying to figure that out. So I'm going to show you some early preliminary stuff, and then then I'm at Casandra. We're going to talk about her experiences at US Bank. So really quickly, there's 7 of these. I'm going to go through them fast so we can get to a little more dialogue. So next slide, please. The first 4 have to do what I call augmentation risk, because there's 2 ways of using AI. One is to use AI, and this is how most people are using it. Use it to support what you're already doing. So you got like Copilot or Gemini or something, or a company version on your desk, and you ask it to build stuff for you, and you ask it questions, and it's kind of very, user driven. And so when you look at this, there's some interesting things. One, there's evidence that shows, again, it's early on evidence that shows that people that use AI, their confidence goes up that they can solve problems, but their confidence goes down that they can solve them on their own. And so if they lose the AI, they will give up. Their commitment goes down a little bit. And so one of these things is like, if you're using AI in this way, how do we make sure that people are using it in a way that builds their sense of confidence that they're becoming smarter through the use of it? And there's an interesting research that says it really comes down to people should not ask AI to do things for them. They should engage AI and how can we do this together, especially if it's more complicated. It's very similar to a good mentoring or coaching relationship in general. Also, if something's really important, encourage people to work without it. If you really want people to put their full mental attention on something, say, look, I don't want you to have AI write that document. I want it to come out of your own brain, because then you can use AI to test what you wrote. And actually, personally, that's how I use it myself, is, yeah, you write it yourself or do the thing yourself, then have AI come back on it. The second thing that's interesting with AI, and both of these 2 things came from student research, is it can weaken relationships between people. One of the ways that we build community at work is through talking to people about challenges we're facing. And when you start using AI instead of having like shared workspaces and online chat rooms, you actually lose that human connection. And so thinking about how do we use AI where we create create actions. I think there's going to be a lot more emphasis on need to create actions that bring people together to discuss shared challenges. I think a lot of effective use of in-person. If you read any of my stuff, I do not believe in these mandates of everyone migrate into the office 5 days a week like lemmings. But at the same time, a key part of work is bringing people together. And I think we have to get a lot more strategic in our use of human to human interaction and be willing to invest in making that happen. Next slide, please. So on the two more augmentation risks. This one is it can cause excessive rumination, or the ability to AI brain fry. I like this one. And on this one, this is what happened. Computer programmers have lived in this world forever. The thing about computer programming is it's like a problem, and you can always do one more thing, and you can always figure it out. And I literally stopped being a programmer. I started out as a computer programmer because I couldn't sleep at night. I couldn't stop thinking about this stuff. And my wife was like, "You're having nightmares about these programs. This is not healthy for you." Plus, it didn't add that I wasn't a very good computer programmer, so I had real nightmares about not being able to do it. But the point is, learning how to switch off. I think a lot of people are experiencing now things with AI because they're basically doing kind of programming on their own, that if you talk to computer programmers, this is why they work all night long, and the classic programmer, sitting there in a room for 24 hours. So we need to make sure people don't get caught into that. So like building, a culture that encourages people to take time offline. It can also create a false sense of security. This is an interesting study that just came out that found that managers trusted AI more than they trusted their own employees. And they thought, well, if AI did it, it must be right. Well, not necessarily. And this gets when you get into the details. Actually, some of the most useful information that you want as a company hasn't been digitalized, so AI can't know it. It's information that's in people's heads. There's information about relationships and context that AI doesn't have any insight into. So on this, really, one of the things that can be really critical is building more critical skills, really educating people on how to effectively use AI, not to overtrust it. This is an area that I'm sure we're going to see a lot of more research over, but it's something to be thinking about now when you're talking about AI literacy. How are you training people on how to critically review AI to say, when should I or when should I not trust it? So those are the 4 augmentations. I got 3 more on the automation. Hope everyone's following along here. This is the hardest thing about doing these webinars, Casandra, you can't see anyone in the audience. I'm just praying that they're all like, yeah, this is really good. They're not just like, oh my God, will this guy ever stop talking? Okay, thank you, Kerry.
There are well over 100 people in the audience, just to let you know. So you do have
I'm
an
loving
audience.
the emojis. Thank you. I appreciate that. Thank you very, very much. AI can't do that. Only people can care. So thank you. That means a lot to me. Okay, so let's get into the automation risks. The next slide, please. Automation risks. So using AI, this is the AI is going to take my job fear, right? Whereas AI it affects people's sense of identity. It's like I saw this this is my fear. This is where I'm really am afraid of AI. There's 2 places where I'm really afraid of AI. One, it makes it easy to fake absolutely everything. So I will say, I don't want to talk about non-work stuff, but as we go into this political season, if you ever see like a video or ad that just riles you up, assume it's fake. If you see something that's really boring and hard to understand, then it's probably real. But that's the one thing I do scares me personally about AI, is how easy to fake stuff. But the other thing is something my brother said. In the future, getting service from an actual human being will be a luxury reserved for the very wealthy. I have this fear of AI turning the whole world into a vending machine. And I've seen this experience when I travel a lot, going into like a coffee shop. And part for me, getting a cup of coffee in a coffee shop is having a brief moment of human interaction, a fleeting smile, a stupid joke. It's a brief connection with that barista. Now you go into a lot of these airport coffee shops, and everything is done automated through a technology, press in your order, pay here, da 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 da, and there's a person just standing around in case something breaks. And I'm just like, you're just taking away these jobs. And so I think a lot of this is, how do we define the role that humans, every company says we're going to keep humans in the loop. We really need to define what those humans are going to be doing in the loop to make sure that they see that this is valuable. The last one is the other one is requiring experts to use AI where it's challenging their expertise. And looking at how do we really amplify the value of what those experts are doing and make sure they're using an AI that's building their expertise, but also value what they know beyond the AI. So we really have to think a lot about how this really comes down to thinking about how AI is changing work and redefining work to emphasize again the two things that AI can't do. It can't care about people. It can act like it cares. We like to say AI is like processed food. A little bit's okay, but too much of it's really bad for you. AI can act like care. So, we really need to think about how do we help define jobs where caring is a key part of it. Also on expertise, how do we define jobs where use of AI doesn't degrade people's expertise, it builds their expertise. And I have one last risk on augmentation and a couple little tips, and then Cassandra, you're going to be on. So, next slide. This last one is a really interesting one. This is algorithmic management. This is basically life as an Uber driver, but it's being expanded into life as a call center worker, life in like a service job, where you're being managed by a technology. And the two risks of this, one is part of a good management employee relationship is knowing you have a manager who cares about you. And so how do we make sure we keep that? But the other one is AI never sleeps. And there's some research that's come out recently that, having people monitored all the time, it exhausts them. It's like, turn the camera off occasionally. Just let me be me. And so how do we build those breaks in? Because just because we have the ability to monitor people all the time doesn't mean we should. Now, it's interesting. It doesn't mean people don't want to be monitored and getting feedback. They don't, people are okay being measured because it's valuable if it's helping them. But how do we make sure this measurement isn't just for the company, it's also helping the employee? So next slide. So the last sort of thing is going into like transitioning into an AI world, just some things, and these are really came out of the book Talent Tectonics because it talked a lot about the impact of technology on work. The first one is people don't fear change. They fear uncertainty and loss. And so I think what's really critical is we need to define what humans in the loop are going to be doing after AI is implemented, bringing employees along, making them part of that change so it's not done to them, they're shaping it, and then show a path for transformation of how's the company going to help them transition, that it's not just about reducing headcount. A second one is, and it's funny, my dad, he hated the word artificial intelligence. He said, these things are just pattern recognition algorithms. They're not human. It's a horrible use of the language. Avoid anthropomorphizing these things as much as possible. That's going to be hard. Don't give them cutesy names or little avatars. Downplay that because it leads to very unhealthy interactions and approaches to using them. That's probably very hard to do, but at least try to do it. Get better. This one is an interesting one. Get better at tracking the human value. Going back to my example of the service job, we're horrible as a society of measuring the value of really good service workers, and that's why we pay them all exactly the same, even though there's huge differences in the value of service work, and it's absolutely a skilled trade. How do we get much better at valuing the things that are uniquely human so that we can not automate them away and we can recognize and celebrate and financially reward the value of people? And then last, AI, it's both cause and the solution to a lot of our problems. There's a lot of stuff that AI can do around helping skills management, around career pathing. It's really good for learning. I said it can't care about you, but it can do a lot of other stuff that really helps with learning. And it can also do some really interesting stuff about sensing people's emotional feelings and actions in it. So these are things that I spend a lot of my time talking about, but I'm going to stop talking. I'm going to bring on Cassandra and kind of set the stage. So Cassandra, I've laid out all the problems and you've got all the solutions, right?
Right. No, not at all. But I can talk a little bit about my experience at US Bank in implementing AI and how we've sort of addressed some of these problems. But we are not completely there either. As you said, it's new, it's, brave new territory, right? And so some of these are still, in development, even in our workplace.
Yeah, thanks. So go to the next slide, please. So as the audience, this is also the option for the audience to please put in questions as we go along. Again, Sandra and I talked about this, and here's the questions that I'm going to ask her, or she is going to answer. So, tell me about the work you're doing, guidelines you've had, how you handle accountability for the use of AI, what your company's philosophies are, how you've used AI, how's the use of AI been responding to my employees, and how has AI impacted your talent and workforce management practices. That's what we're going to do. Cassandra has some really cool slides and content, but again, we love that human interaction. So don't hesitate. And Leslie, I will look for you if anyone has a question to come off and let us know about that. And Leslie, also, Cassandra and I also invite you onto this too, because
I know.
Leslie's not just a moderator. She knows a ton about this stuff too.
I'm keeping my eye open. I did want to let you know, in case you didn't know, there's over 117 participants. So there are people on this webinar, okay, and people are very interested. There are some comments coming in, but I would love to, as Steve said, welcome questions. But let's hear from Cassandra. Yes, great.
Right. Cassandra, we'll do this one. Tell about your role and experiences, and let Justin know if you want to jump to the slides. So as I'll let you direct him. So.
Absolutely. Let's jump to the next slide, actually.
Okay.
So basically, my role at US Bank is sort of an oversight role with respect to AI, as well as, machine learning, as well as generative AI implementation at the bank. So really what that means, I would say, is, we've got a number of different use cases for this technology across the bank. But my role in the department that I manage essentially makes sure that it's used responsibly, and also that it works as intended. We, conduct the performance monitoring, as well as do the initial validation to make sure that, in fact, the method is appropriate for the use case as it was designed. I have an interesting view of AI at US Bank because we are the governance mechanism and the validation mechanism. We see use cases all across the bank, right? And some of those are highlighted here, are primary use cases. Operational efficiency is a big one. I think that's what most people think of when they think of like generative AI, Copilot being the perfect example of that, right? The large language models really help, reduce some of the manual workload, as well as automate some of the information gathering that is used for decisioning, even if it is human decisioning. When it comes to aggregating information, collecting information, AI is extremely good at doing that, right? And so that is one of our primary use cases. It's also good at synthesizing large amounts of information at once. And when it comes to like fraud detection or financial crimes, you think of like economic sanctions, for example. Those are really enforced by banks, right? By scanning millions and millions of transactions, looking for patterns, looking for, individuals, all sorts of things that really help us identify what could be either a fraudulent or illegal transaction. And then from there, humans review those and actually investigate those to make sure that we're not relying on AI to, make a decision about whether somebody's a criminal or not, right? Ultimately, that is humans that are making that. Also, when it comes to credit management, risk management types of stuff, everyone's familiar with a credit score. That's not a machine learning technique, although they are dipping their toes into that. But when it comes to credit decisioning or credit detection, deterioration, things like that, that's also a case that we're definitely using machine learning techniques across the bank. As well as, productivity and customer engagement type of use cases. Typically we, try to limit the customer interface with generative AI, but that is coming, right? That's where we are now. I suspect within a couple of years that there's going to be less and less of that. And, Steve alluded to, basically where the world becomes a vending machine, right? And that is, we are moving towards more of that, but ultimately, you have to be very, very careful about where it's utilized and where it's not, because it ultimately can, from a worker perspective, but also from a customer perspective, can have negative implications.
Yeah, Cassandra, I'd like to jump on that point because I think I'm curious as you're looking at that world, as we're all, this fear of nobody likes being stuck on like, press 7 or AI is pretending to be people. Actually, that's almost even more annoying. But I'm curious. I'm curious a story where I've seen a really good application. So Tyler Weeks is another IO psychologist from Portland, and he does a lot of Marriott. Marriott's doing some really interesting stuff with AI to support their HR generalists. They want to give in the hotels, but in the design of their system, they're saying we don't recognizing the big part of being an HR generalist is creating that connection with employees. They have this chatbot that answers all these transactional questions, but there are certain questions, like if somebody says, how do I transfer my Marriott 401k to another company's 401k? It's like, that sounds like they may be thinking of quitting. It flags that and says, hey, go have a conversation with this person. There's there's something behind this that is more than just a transactional question. And you can think of a lot of HR questions where that would be true, where it'd be like, this should be dug into more. Is US Bank doing that when you're looking at like your customer service work, where you're saying some things people might be asking about a bank probably, could say, wow, this person is dealing with some other issues we should dig into more deeply?
Absolutely. That would be our marketing department primarily. When someone is asking questions about a life event, for example, that can be an indicator of bank products that they may be interested in, additional bank products that they're not necessarily inquiring about, but people's lives succession, is fairly predictable, and using information that they are giving the bank can help us better market to them. I mean, to be honest with you. And so that's definitely a thing from a consumer perspective, also from an HR perspective as well.
Yeah, I'm going to give a tip. If you ever want to get past a company's AI technology, act like you want to give the company money. This works with insurance companies. It works with. No, that's interesting. Yeah, because I think increasingly a shift is going to. It used to be when we looked at technology, it's like how much can we automate things away. Now I think increasingly we're going to be focusing on where do we want to design humans into a process that could be entirely automated.
Mm-hmm.
It's sort of shifting the thinking in that area.
Well, can I ask? I know we're kind of going through some of Cassandra's questions, but I'm wondering. I mean, bringing in the human, and what do you each see in terms of well-being risks for the human? I mean, as we really dive in and and roll forward with AI.
Mm-hmm. Cassandra, I'll let you answer that first, then I've got some sort of thoughts that I'm seeing.
Yeah, and actually we can flip to the next slide on that.
Okay.
Because
All right,
there's a couple of, I think that, yes, so human in the loop, actually, this sort of addresses that. So there's a couple of bullets at the bottom, actually. Over-reliance on AI, and basically, you alluded to the expertise aspect of, do you trust yourself better more than you trust the AI? And is the proper expertise in the proper position to be a human in the loop? Those are sort of two sides of the same coin. But ultimately, from a well-being perspective, I mean, I guess, would have a tendency, or at least I would have a tendency to, maybe question my own expertise sometimes. If the AI says one thing and I think another thing, sometimes you have so you sort of second guess yourself essentially. And so from a workforce happiness perspective, that can definitely have impacts, right? It also, it can devalue expertise from an external perspective as well, right? When your questions can just be answered by AI, what's the point of having a subject matter expert, right? Everything's available on the internet. It's got to be right, But ultimately, as well as new data is introduced, it comes from people's heads first. And you talked about that, Steve, right? The real updated and timely information is actually in the heads of those subject matter experts and of those people that are doing and living it every day before it actually makes it into the model, right? And so ultimately, humans do have a lot to offer, but complement AI. It's at least at US Bank, is not a decision maker. It's a decision support tool. It complements subject matter experts. And so I think that's one thing that we really have to remember when it comes to like the value of expertise. It's, it is valuable, right? And we really need to communicate that to employees and, really celebrate that honestly, and, value employees and what they have to offer.
Yeah, I think and I think that value in employees, and the key thing is redefining the jobs for humans in the loop. I think where, Leslie, I think like the well-being risk, for example, is if you use AI, let's use customer service jobs, and the AI is handling all the transactional parts of customer service, and the only reason you're bringing a person in is when something is so complicated the AI can't handle it, or the person is so emotionally distraught that your job is to calm them down, right? Well, that's a very different job, and it's a very more mentally taxing job if you're trying to solve really complicated problems, or your job is to try to calm somebody down, or change it, manage their emotions. And I think this is one of the really issues that I think companies haven't grasped yet, which is, I think on the expert side, companies are good at managing expertise. The challenge we're having though is that AI is creating a gulf between highly skilled and new employees, because it's like, how do you create senior programmers when you've automated all your junior programmer jobs away? And companies are aware of this and they're starting to think about it. So it's like, how do we make sure that we have some path? And increasingly also realizing the job of your senior experts isn't to do the work, it's also to teach other people, which is a very different thing from what those jobs were in the past. I think that that's a real transformation. The On the emotional side, this is where I get really, really worried. It is very emotionally exhausting for people that are put into jobs with their jobs to make people feel better. And historically, our society does not value that work. I always say, why is the person that builds the hospital bed paid so much more than the home healthcare aide who is in there to help make sure that your aging people are having a decent quality of life? It's actually, I talk about this in talent tectonics. It's actually, I won't get into it, but it's rooted in systematic sexism of our society. There was actually a law back in when they first started tracking jobs in like the 1910s. The head of the census for the labor statistics said, "Oh, these service jobs are mainly performed by women. Let's call them unskilled." I mean, it was literally a conscious desire to devalue service work. Sadly, this legacy lives on, and I think that's why one of the things that I stress there is that from a well-being perspective, people can handle really, really, really demanding jobs if they feel they're appreciated, they're supported, and they're recognized. If they feel like they're just viewed as a cost until the company can find some way to reduce them out, that's where I think we just see a lot of people with just a heightened anxiety and burning out. And I think that's where we are right now. We're in this weird space right now trying to figure that out. So I don't
Well,
have any answer.
yeah, I mean, I think there's a number of issues that we do need to be paying attention to, and from an occupational health psychology perspective and a total worker health perspective, I there's a lot that this field can, and psychology more generally, can do
Hmm.
to really support more healthy deployment of AI. I mean, I think about all of the concerns around job insecurity, fears of job loss, techno stress, which there were some comments
Hmm.
earlier. Also the concerns around surveillance, and so that creates an enormous amount of stress. There also, I mean, we need to look at in terms of from a health and safety and well-being perspective, that AI can also had benefits by alleviating some of these extremely demanding jobs by perhaps automating some of these extremely demanding jobs. So there's a flip. But I do want to go to, there is a question in the chat, and I want to encourage questions in the chat. So it's going to kind of switch gears a little bit. But I'd like to go to the question in the chat for you guys to see if you have anything to add here.
Yeah.
And this was Kate Wood. Thanks, Kate. So the question is, what does your educational system, specifically K through 12, need to do today to prepare students for future work? Do you both have thoughts on that?
Oh, I've got thoughts. Cassandra, you want to go first?
No, you go ahead, Steve, and then I will
Okay.
follow up on my thoughts as well.
Well, I think one is we have to lean into use of AI. Going back to your point too, Leslie, that's AI. So like one of the things AI is really good for actually is coaching. I mean, not the caring part of it, but AI gives us much more availability to a level of coaching and feedback and diagnostic that would not be possible. You couldn't have individual tutors for every student, just like you can't have individual coaches for every employee. So it's democratizing a lot of sort of, more individualized learning and development. Um, Again, we have to make sure we don't take the human out. The humans, need to be there and caring. So I think in education, one, just really leveraging this technology, learning how to use it effectively. The other is embracing it within students. The way I just wrote an article on my Substack about this, that you talk about AI literacy or AI fluency, it's literally like learning another language in a lot of ways. You learn how it works, you learn to interact. The more you use it, the more intelligent you become about what is good and what it doesn't do. So I think that it should be absolutely incorporated in. We can figure out how to deal with all the testing and faking stuff. That is a solvable problem. And the last thing, as far as like skills, the thing that I do like a podcast called Integrate or Die, where I've interviewed a lot of people that are on the leading edge of using this technology. And when we always ask them, what should people learn, and they say the skill that probably the two that are going to be the most important. One is really good carrying emotional intelligence skills, because that's often increasingly what we want people to do, and that is a skill. We haven't historically treated it as a skill, but it absolutely is a skill. And the other one is critical thinking skills. Getting really good at critical thinking and detailing and kind of knowing what questions and how to look at AI. That absolutely is another skill. I think we don't need to focus as much on like sort of declarative knowledge, because it's at our fingertips. Why teach people to memorize where all the states are if you can just tell AI to tell you where all the states are? I mean, as painful as that makes me feel, I think it's the truth.
Yeah.
And yeah.
So I would
Yeah.
second that. In terms of critical evaluation is actually, I think, where education can improve in the world of AI, basically. So, I have a 12-year-old son, right? And I see how, basically things that he sees on YouTube, they're true, right? And I often have to talk to him, well, think about this. Like, does this make sense? Is this something that could truly happen? Is this, just these critical evaluation skills that I feel like are so important. I mean, you're right that the fakes and things like that, we will have better methods and develop better methods for rooting that out. But at the end of the day, like the user still has to be able to critically evaluate what they're seeing and basically recognize truth and falsehood, basically. If you want to go to my next slide, I talk a little bit about how we do this at the bank, but I think that, going back to the well-being part as well, trust in AI and that you're actually getting the information that, you think you're getting and that you can really truly rely on it is another, thing that we need to consider as, employers, because ultimately, the employees, the users of the AI need to be able to evaluate, but also need to be able to trust the information that they're getting and have confidence in it, especially if they are that human in the loop who is then, relaying that information in a customer service capacity, right?
Justin, can you go to the next slide, please?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, so I mean, this is, I'll leave most of this as red, but it really, relates to the workforce aspect of this. But I think this applies to education as well. We need to teach kids to, critically evaluate information that they're given. And this is not necessarily new to, education. I mean, anytime that you were, learning to write a research paper, right? It was critically evaluating your sources, right? It's very similar. It's just got a new spin on it.
Yeah, I think there was a comment used. Somebody I don't catch the name said, the importance of training people's brain, and I wanted to comment that. I think that's really important. I think the key is we have to focus on what is it we need to train their brains to. So if I'll use, one of my undergrad degrees in applied mathematics, and I'll tell you the mathematics. Learning mathematics, it's learning a language. It trains your brain, and it's hard and it's difficult. So I think probably the greatest value that I personally have gotten out of it is it's taught me how to think through really complicated problems. And it's because that's what it is. So I think there's a lot of stuff where we probably, from an educational standpoint, and not just for employees and people, is we need to find what are the skills we need to train people's brains on. Like one of the things I wonder about is, everyone relies on GPS to get around all the time, and orientation and spatial awareness is a developed skill. It is a skill that, somebody says, well, I'm no good at it. It's like, because you probably haven't trained yourself on it. Now, how much effort should we put on it? I don't know. That's another question. But do I think there's probably value in people being able to navigate without having a phone? Probably. I kind of joke if the satellites ever go down, like 25% of America will never make it home. Tell me when to turn left. So I think that point on that, yes, I think that's we probably are in a phase right now where, and Leslie, going back to psychology, um, we need to figure out what are the skills that we need to train people on and how we train them. But just the declarative knowledge memorization stuff doesn't really make a lot of sense. And then I think on the self-regulation, I think we're learning a lot about how to, certainly in social media world, how appropriate social regulation. So I think that we're going through that phase too. We have to figure out those are skills too.
Steve, there is a question in it's a kind of extensive here, from Tyler in the chat, and was interested in really how kind of your framing of automation of mental tasks and moving away from Fordist production, etc. I don't know if you have any thoughts about that before we move on.
I will look at the chat question and come back to you.
Okay, why don't you do that? And there's actually another.
Well, I have a comment actually on that question before we move away
awesome.
from that, because that's one of the things we keep talking about, the risks of well-being when it comes to AI, but I would say largely one of the benefits of AI is the banality, those tasks, those rote memorization type, the boring stuff. It takes care of a lot, and I really think that at least with my job and how I've implemented AI in my work, it's gotten rid of a lot of that stuff. So it's made my job more enjoyable. And I think that focusing on the risks is great, but there's really a lot of reward as well. And I think that that's one of the things that work managers really need to speak to when talking about AI. It's like, I mean, some people love coding. I personally don't, right? And I'm glad that I don't have to do it anymore, right? I'm not mad about that, So, and there's other applications too, that it really takes away some of those boring tasks, for lack of a better term.
Absolutely, 100%. I totally agree with you. I want to mention I had dropped a few citations early on, and I want to draw attention to Tara Probst's it's kind of a set of commentaries that were published in occupational health science, and in that set of commentaries kind of addresses both, right, not just the risks but the benefits. And I think there was, I can't remember the actual person who wrote the section on flourishing, but how AI can also really lead to flourishing and positive psychological outcomes, in addition to, as we've talked about, the alleviation of some of these monotonous or dangerous. I mean, it also can take over some dangerous tasks. I mean, if we start to talk about automation, so it's not just risks on the human side, there are benefits on the human side, 100%.
Oh yeah, and I want to build sort of, Cassandra, on a couple of things that you said there, because like one, I will tell one company, my favorite example, where they were bringing employees along in the journey, which I think is really important. The people that know how to use AI effectively are your people out there doing it, and the degree. And they went in and they said, "What part of your work sucks?" that was the question they started, and usually it was the stuff I have to do, and it's kind of complicated. I have to pay attention to it, but I don't really enjoy doing it because it's kind of solving the same problem over and over and over again. And that's where they focused on using AI, was to take that part of work where it's like your example of computer programming. I'm right there with you. I know how it works. I can kind of do it, but I don't want to do it because I hate paying attention to details. So, and I think you can look at that. But then the challenge, I think, is then you have to define, okay, if that's like 50% of your job, the immediate anxiety is, well, what am I going to be doing? And this has been a problem we've had with technology before. I remember, this is years ago, actually implementing machine learning for recruiting. This is going 20 years ago in like a grocery store. And it basically, all their HR generalists had spent a lot of time sorting through applications, and suddenly it was all being automated. And I remember this meeting with the CHRO of the grocery chain, where the VPs were like, "Hey, our HR generalists are nervous about what they're going to do when they're not doing what he thought was a boring process they wouldn't want to do anyhow." And his answer was, "I've got an idea. Why don't they go out and talk to the employees?" Because they didn't have time to do that before. And this is like sort of the same thing, So I think a lot of that, though, is what's really key in this process is we need to define what that next generation of work is looking like, because that's the finish line that employees can be excited about or be afraid of.
Let me
Um,
interject another question from the audience. And Crystal asked, can you speak to the environmental impacts of AI? Is more use of AI exacerbating the energy crisis, increasing use of AI? Is that going to be sustainable? I think I personally have been watching Aaron Brockovich, who's now kind of tracking all of the data centers across the country. So what do you all have any, I mean, this is not, I mean, this kind of, we're really going beyond here, but if you have any thoughts about environmental impacts, if you
question
can share
about
them.
planetary well-being. Um, I'll let you, Cassandra. I mean, I
You
any
know, I
thoughts?
mean, I think that they're, obviously they're going to need to upgrade the power infrastructure to support the data centers, right? And I do like the direction that PGE went, for example, with, not putting all that cost on the customers, right? In the recent rate increase request, it was sort of separating out the users, like the user types, if you will. So from that perspective, I know that's not exactly an environmental impact, but nonetheless, I think it is a planetary community well-being impact, right? I mean, consumers should not basically bear all the costs for the infrastructure upgrades that are required because of the power usage from data centers, right? The other thing is my sister actually made a really funny comment about, because we were having a conversation about this, and she's like, I've got no problem with it, but then I see all the dumb stuff that is being supported by these data centers, like, stupid AI videos. Like, at what point, obviously they're not bearing the cost for what that, the creator and the user of that energy is not bearing the cost, directly, right? There's some sort of, or else it wouldn't make as much sense to, create dumb AI videos that you see all over the internet, right? So that's just a couple of, thoughts that I've had. But yeah, I mean, how you distribute those across society, I think is something we're still working on. And this is the economist in me coming out, how you basically assign benefits and costs to the, ultimately the beneficiaries of the technology.
Yeah, I think if you can come up with some method to have people not use energy and technology to do stupid things, then
I know,
please
right?
share. But I don't know. It is a larger issue. I think that we could get. I think it's something we need to be thinking about a lot. And it is one of the dangers. They say that AI is heavily funded now, and these tokens are going to probably go up in cost. And so if a company gets overly dependent on what was cost efficient now, won't be cost efficient if the tokens suddenly are 100 times more expensive. So there's some interesting stuff how that will play out. I did have a quick question. I did look at the questions about Fordism and intellectual labor. So I think, Tyler, it's a obviously pretty involved discussion, but I would say that what you're talking about is agentic AI is going to take over when you have these complex linked together, just if you say intellectual assembly lines or whatever, it's going to be, I think that's the kind of thing agentic AI will eventually take over. But the challenge with agentic AI and why it's, and we're seeing this, and this would, Cassandra, I'd be curious, and you're seeing this too, but with the companies, the thing you have to remember, AI is a data processing tool. That's what it does. It takes data in and it does really complicated stuff with it and it spits data out. And it's only what it can do depends on the data that can get going. And there's sort of like three kinds of data that I like to talk about that affect the use of AI. The big language models we're all used for are all trained on the internet data. And I liken the data on the internet to like a farmer's market. It's a mess, but everything is there designed to be discoverable, right? You can find it if you look around enough. The really useful data that differentiates for a company, the company data is more like the Pentagon. It's all in like locked file cabinets and locked rooms, and it's not necessarily stored really well, and it's really hard to get access to. And often, that we don't really know exactly how some things work. And then the really, really valuable data, and Cassandra, you talked about, is in people's heads, the real differentiating data. So this move to agentic AI, what we've seen happen really quickly is for sort of generic things that you could do with just internet data, it's happening really fast, but you're running into a wall really quickly with companies that are trying to apply it using internal company data because it's just a whole different data set. Is that what you're seeing in a U.S. bank?
To some degree, yeah. When it comes to, agentic AI is something that is, I mean, that's the brand new territory, right? And, we are implementing that for certain workflows and work processes across the bank. How that is ultimately going to, impact worker, I guess, happiness and, how it's going to change the nature of jobs is still sort of up in the air. As I said, it's brand new. And we actually, when it comes to agentic AI, everything we have is still in pilot production, right? We don't have anything that's actually in full production at this point. So it's still an open question, I guess, is the answer to that.
Yeah, yeah. And you have to be careful because, I mean, there's already examples of companies that have had horrific mistakes using agentic AI.
Mhm.
I did my question, and then, so there's sort of the other questions we had that we sort of hinted at but haven't dove into specifically. One is the leadership philosophy
Yep.
that U.S. Bank has taken, because part of that is, are we going to eliminate jobs? Are we not going to? What is our commitment to that? That's part of it, but there's other things. So that, question, what is the sort of the leadership philosophy? And then the last question is, how are employees reacting to all this stuff?
Yeah. So can we jump to, I think it's slide 26, because I
Okay.
talked a little bit about that. And then, yeah, I have a specific use case that I think would be really valuable that I'll go into next. So yeah, if we could jump to slide 20, I think it's 26 in the Justin.
AI philosophy, yeah.
Yeah. Oh
Justin,
wait,
can you
the
take
next one.
the slide?
Well, that'll work. This works too. Oh,
Oh,
there's where I wanted. Thank you.
okay,
AI
yay.
philosophy, yeah. So basically, when it comes to our philosophy, we are really looking to support decision making. And I think I've said that over and over and over in this presentation. We are not trying to outsource major critical decision making to AI, right? It's not something that we think is, good for our customers, and it's definitely not something that's really good for our employees either. When it comes to the employee well-being, the expertise, all of that kind of stuff, when it comes to critical decision making, we're not interested in that. Now, we are very interested in using it to augment decision making, and to make workflows smoother, but also to give more information to employees in a more timely fashion, right? But that does have an impact on how jobs are designed, ultimately, and how humans interact with the technology, right? And so when it comes to well-being as well, we are looking to automate things that are not critical or are much more manual in terms of like data entry things. Even like most people here are probably not super familiar with banking, but one of the things, getting customers' financial statements into a usable format, right? We can automate all of that now. But that was where most people started their careers, including myself, like a basic credit analyst role. So talking about how we still offer that kind of training to employees so that they understand the numbers that they're getting ultimately, because that you would develop that understanding through taking your customers' financial statements that may or may not, be perfectly not inaccurate, but not well organized, right? Some people have different levels of bookkeeping, right? And making that make sense, right? How you still develop that is something we're still working out, but ultimately, it's doable, right? Also, when it comes to the philosophy of our AI use, we're trust but verify, I guess, is what the how the saying goes. You want to develop and utilize AI systems that are that are basically trustworthy, but at the same time, there's hallucination risk in anything, right? And for those of you who are not familiar with that term, AI makes things up, right? And so you have to install guardrails basically to sort of eliminate that as much as possible. But ultimately, it's up to the human in the loop to make that final decision about, really the authenticity of the information that they're getting and how they're using it, if they're using it appropriately too. That's the other thing, when it comes to philosophy. And one of the primary things that model risk management evaluates is, like how information is used and is it appropriate in the context? Because this is, part of like marrying the information that's in someone's head, understanding how this is operating in the general context, and then ultimately deciding if the decision that the AI is generating makes sense in that particular context. And so you can't just apply, an AI use case, across the bank, right? When it comes to, for example, like credit deterioration, right? Certain things may be recognized in one industry or in one product type that are not going to apply elsewhere, right? And so thinking of, through things like that is what, from a philosophical perspective, is really where we need humans and how we would like our employees to interact with AI.
I think that's
Cassandra,
one thing. I was
Steve,
just going
I was going to
go
pop
ahead.
into I think there's a related question in the
Okay.
chat related to kind of AI and creativity. And there's concerns about that, AI may take over some of the creative tasks and, related to even some of the decision
Mhm.
making that you were just talking about. And how are you thinking about that and thinking about the stress that people are, experiencing related to their kind of potential loss of creativity?
Yeah, I think one of the things I wanted to talk on this is in general philosophy that you were talking to Cassandra that I've heard is AI doesn't save time. It allows us to reallocate time. You can't save time. I say like, despite what Jim Croce said about putting it in a bottle, um, you know the I'm dating myself with that reference that song, Leslie, but you got it. So because we're the same age. I could put time in a bottle. But, and I think, but having that thought all the time that when you go, and Sandra, you're talking about that, we're going to use AI and it's going to allow us to have people to reallocate time to use it to look at the things that AI doesn't know or can't know, like contextual things or relationship things. And I think that's a really key part of that. That question on creativity, boy, this triggers some big philosophies on this. Creativity itself is just not is poorly defined. The phrase creativity is poorly defined. But from my own view on it personally, is it's just going to be another technology we use. I mean, it's like when they first came out with digital sampling, and everybody said that's not music and that's not creative. And now I think you'd have a hard time saying that hip hop is a non-creative act because it uses digital sampling of music. So I think we're just going to see new forms of creativity that leverage the capabilities of AI. Do I feel concerned about the fact that we don't have good protection for people that are putting all this data in that AI is using? Yeah, absolutely. It's a plagiarism machine. Um, that's that's a different challenge, but I think that not using this technology to fuel creativity and creation, you're just fighting the tide. It's going to happen. Um, I think that's one of the things we need to figure out, though. Cassandra, any thoughts on that? Creative
I mean, I think,
bookkeeping,
yeah,
is that?
I definitely share your concerns with data protection.
Yeah.
When it comes to, we saw that with the most recent strike, right, in Hollywood, right? I mean,
Mhm.
people are very concerned and rightfully concerned about use of their image and use of their, I mean, yeah, the comparison to sampling I think is really good, particularly
Mhm.
in that example, because,
Mhm.
what do you own? And how do you define that ownership and how do you structure contracts such that, you're just not recreated, right? I mean, you see it on the internet all the time where they'll have these recreations of Hollywood actors, and they'll sit next to their old self, and their young self, stuff like that. It's like, how is that not transferred into movies and how do you maintain, basically your likeness and things like that? It's, a real concern.
Yeah, I think it's, and this larger does get into this, some of the things with AI on this and sort of creativity and its social value, going back to that like, I'll use the example of, I use this processed food example. Look at processed food. There's other cultures, the United States sadly is not one of them, that really put a lot of value and will spend a lot of money to have non-processed food, you know, where I'm not criticizing right or wrong, right? But we're a country that has embraced processed food. Oh, it's awesome. It's cheap. It's inexpensive. And I think I want to give credit. We would have mass starvation in the world if we didn't have processed food. So let's not say, horrific. There's a place for it. But again, too much of it's bad for you. So I think when you get to creativity, when you get to a lot of like that area where is it good is sort of a somewhat subjective thing. I think that's a societal value. It'll be interesting how that changes. I think that they've talked about AI is really bad at creative writing, and poetry is particularly bad at poetry. And they're like, because poetry is this very emotional thing, and but some people don't care about poetry, so who knows? Fascinating. Okay. Employee adoption. Casandra, that was the last I definitely wanted to get into. We sort of been dancing around. Let's do another question, Leslie. We'll always take audience questions first, but I got a whole bag of questions here for Casandra if we don't have any audience questions.
Do you want to? Yeah, this kind of builds on the creativity question. If you're taking a look at this, a frequent concern regarding AI is creativity. Oh, that is the creativity. Hold on.
Yeah.
Is that a new question? It produces average most likely output. Oh yes, the creativity of the material produced. Right.
You see, I think, and that's an issue. Yeah, there's an issue of AI slop, and that's one of the things I talked about.
Right.
Is that it's so easy to create content that not only is it a race to mediocrity, but the other thing is that people feel no felt commitment to it. And I think that's why people will fight harder for like an idea that they really spent a lot of time building or something like that, as opposed to something they just said, oh, AI, give me the next product idea, and it spits something out. So that's a really interesting thing. I think the well-being issue is if we create company cultures that they only value speed over quality, the people that provide quality are going to feel underappreciated. And so much about this, I think, comes back to AI is forcing us to figure out how do we appreciate uniquely human things. And historically, we did not put a lot of value on like, the experience you created for me. It was just how quickly did you bring me my meal kind of thing. And so I think that's a larger change. I think that the positive about it though is this technology will also allow us to measure a lot of this stuff a lot more. So I think we need to embrace measurement, but Leslie, to your point, we don't want to over measure, but we can't value people's performance if we don't measure what it is they're doing. And so that's a larger issue. I did want to get why we have to make sure that we get to the last question that we had on Casandra that we talked about before, which was employee experience. How are people reacting at sort of maybe at different levels? How are leaders reacting to it?
Mm-hmm.
How are middle managers reacting to it? How are line employees reacting to it?
Okay, can we move to the next slide? Because I actually have a case study, and this is an interesting case study because it's actually, so just to get a little, go back to where I was, basically we validate AI models, but this is where we're actually bringing AI into our validation process. So I just want to make that clear. And I'm actually leading this project for model validation. So basically a model validation sort of like goes through the conceptual aspects of a model, is the use case appropriate, does a bunch of performance testing, looks at, builds benchmark models like challenger models, that sort of thing. That's essentially what the process looks like. What we're trying to implement and are in the process of implementing now is basically a combination of standard automation as well as LLMs to streamline some of this work, right? And so I'm actually dealing with this directly in my model validation employees and so employees, leadership, and we can talk about each of those levels, how what the reactions are to this, because this is something I'm living and breathing right now, right? So first I'll start with the leadership, right? This project came from leadership, right? And it's funny because they, very much wanted us to, shorten model validation timelines. Right now, sometimes model validation can take up to 6 months. I mean, usually it's more like 2 or 3, but nonetheless, depending upon the complexity of the model, it takes too long, and I agree. So this actually came as a directive from management. What's interesting about that, though, is, to implement something like this, you need to have, sort of mature cloud infrastructure, right, in the institution. And I would argue that we are barely to the point now where we can support something like this, and the employees are seeing that. when they're doing the testing of these, model validation systems, right? It's like it goes down sometimes. Like we're only allotted this much compute or this much data storage, because, well, the cloud isn't free either, right? The cloud costs money. And so, that these sorts of directives from management are where they're not quite understanding all of the complexity of the implementation of something like this is having an impact on employee experience. Absolutely. So that's one of the employee responses to AI, as well as, the management's all gung ho. Like you can't move fast enough, right? But that said, I think there's got to be a lot of thought about what's really possible. And what is, maybe would require, greater conversations around implementation, sometimes security too, different things like that, that I don't know are more complex than I think a lot of people realize, right? So these are sort of some of the things that, definitely impact the sort of employee response to AI, right? But then, yeah, also things that, we talked about already with respect to, I personally don't like to code, but there are definitely individuals in our validation unit that have no interest in using any sort of low code, code writing automation, right? And that's just, they feel like it's degrading their skills. And they also feel like they can't trust it, right? And they don't know exactly what it's doing behind the black box, even though we are actually trying to implement a system that has complete code transparency. That's a concern, right? And it's a real concern. And especially when it comes to, choosing what you choose to adopt, especially if it's from a vendor, that's something that should definitely be taken into consideration by leadership is, how much transparency is available just for employee comfort, user comfort with it, right? Especially if you're going to have automating some of the functions that the employee used to perform, right? They need to be able to rely on them. And then, also, yeah, we call it productivity in economics, but you don't save time, you reallocate time, right? And so that's another thing. People are worried that what are they going to do? You know what I mean? I mean, for us, I think it's a fairly easy question to answer with this particular use case. It's like, well, you validate models. Models are being used in basically every business line at this point, and the inventory is going to continue to grow. So there's just going to be more models to validate, and hopefully we can do it faster, right? So but that's another thing that I think that, at least leadership when implementing these, particular use cases, really need to, focus on is like the reliability and, really the, I guess, feasibility of implementation, as well as what are people going to do, right? Those are probably the biggest concerns that I see when it comes to like employee skepticism with respect to this particular project and AI in general.
It's a great, great case example. Now I'm actually going to need to ask Steve to you don't have to take down your slides. I have to ask Justin to take down Steve's slides and put back up our final kind of closing slides, because I know that some folks are going to need to know how to obtain their SHRM credit, and we have information there. And I just wanted to thank Casandra and Steve so much because, I think that there's more questions than answers right now. It's just kind of coming at us so quickly. And we do have a lot of questions, and we have a lot of questions from both a practice perspective as well as from a research perspective. And I want to come back to that. I think that really occupational health and occupational health psychology has a lot to contribute in terms of really understanding the implementation and in supporting the implementation so that it can be positive for both the employer and the employee. Your input has been really incredible, and I think we've had a lively conversation. I want to remind folks that we actually have another follow-up event on this same topic on July 14th, and I think I guess that's the SHRM. Okay, that's the SHRM activity code. Great. And Justin, if we have a slide on the follow-up event, maybe not, or maybe it's a QR code. Wait, go back, QR code. So we have another event with Dr. Tahara Probst and Dr. David Dorr, as I mentioned, and we'll draw on kind of established work design, occupational health frameworks, introducing more around AI and also bringing in more from a research perspective. So in terms of today, the SHRM credit, the code was provided. Also, you can reach out to Amy Spring directly if you are having problems finding that credit. And then finally, I just want to ask you to please complete the evaluation you will receive the evaluation once you actually, once the event closes. So this helps us in planning future events and designing the events so that they are most effective for our audiences. So, as Steve and Cassandra, any last comments you want to make?
Well, one, I'd like to say if people, I'm actively doing this. If people found my stuff interesting, please reach out on LinkedIn, Stephen T. Hunt. I write about this stuff. I'm also on Substack. I'm writing an article on those 7 sort of risks right now. I saw somebody wanting like the research, and I'll have that article put up probably in the next week. So you can find me on Substack. And really enjoyed this conversation. So, and then Leslie, I want to thank you and Cassandra for putting this together. And I guess the last thing I would say from a well-being stuff is we really need to start getting good at measuring how, and I hate to go from a negative perspective, but so much of well-being, investment of well-being came from showing how much accidents cost companies. You know, it was like, look how much money it costs us when we have accidents. And that's kind of a sad way. I think that's something that in this field, we need to really get really good at showing the cost of not taking this stuff seriously. And I hate to say that, I hate to be so negative about it, but I just know that's kind of how companies think. So
Thanks,
I
Steve.
feel like I
Cassandra?
ended on a downer.
Yeah. Maybe Steve,
No,
you
it's not
Cassandra?
wrong. It's not wrong. And yeah, I just want to thank co-presenters. This was a great opportunity, and yeah, that's really all I have.
Great. Well, and thank you all who attended the webinar. We appreciate you, and we welcome you to more of our events. So thanks, everybody. Great.
Thank
Thank you.
you. Thank